Hello, this is Dr. Dennis Bielfeldt of the Christ School of Theology. You're listening to a series of lectures dealing with the philosophical background to the development of the theological tradition. And today we'll be talking about the early medieval period, and we'll be looking at some of the general things that were happening at the time. For instance, the rise of the universities is kind of a big deal. We see these schools coming to the fore. People generally say in the 12th century the universities arose in Europe. Well, in the beginning, these schools clustered around ecclesiastical centers, and scholars really at the beginning had privileges like clergy. You could be ordained to be a clergy person, or you're basically working to become a scholar. And the scholarly activity was thought to be a divine kind of thing. And so you had many of the same privileges as a scholar that the clergy had. Between the Loire and the Rhine in central France, schools began to develop in the 12th century and clustered around teachers. And of course they would come into being as the teacher exerted a strong influence. They might flourish for a while, they decay. But we see one school there that flourished, developed, and stay, and that was at Paris. So we see in Paris a school arising with a tradition. In northern Italy, we see schools starting to develop. Here we see them teaching law. Paris is more theology. During the 12th and 13th centuries, schools developed in France, England, Italy, and in northern Spain. The oldest universities come from the late 12th century. The oldest are in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford. By the mid-13th centuries, schools are also developing, and the first university in the East is in Prague, in the year 1348, which of course is very close to the bubonic plague. I was thinking about that, 1349. Erfurt, of course, where Luther went to school and got his master's, that was founded in 1392. By the end of the 15th century, there are about 70 universities in being. Mendicant orders arose by the close of the 12th century, and they instituted a studia generalia, where friars learned philosophy and theology. So this was happening in these orders as well. And with William of Ockham, we find that his education is basically here, not up at Oxford, but here in one of these settings. The quality of the universities varied in accordance with funding. Now, isn't that a new thing, right? So some became quite good and some maybe not as good. While all granted the ius ubique docendi, that is the right to teach anywhere, things being what they are, one could not really get a job teaching in Paris without a degree from Paris. Right? Paris was famous for logic and theology. We find in Spain the civil and canon law. By 1250, everywhere the basic faculty was a faculty of arts. So you find here, this is very interesting, this development of the faculty of arts. Of course, concentrating on the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, and logic, and the quadrivium, geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and music. And then, of course, Aristotelian philosophy was coming to the fore at this time as well. Students normally matriculated between 15 and 21 years of age. And of course, funding studies, as it is today, was an issue for students then. And only about 15% or so of those could actually ever complete an MA. Many students never completed a BA, a bachelor's. In fact, I think it's around 70% of all students receive no degree, if I remember correctly here. Now, after you received an MA in the Masters of Arts program in philosophy, you could go on and study law, medicine, and theology. These were the big three: law, medicine, and theology. By the 15th century, 20% of all matriculating students were in law, 5% in theology, and fewer in medicine. Isn't that interesting? Even in the 15th century, more students went into law than theology. And of course, even in the 15th century, the study of theology was not a career move. Most of the medieval philosophical literature was produced by the MA faculties as they developed. And of course, oftentimes here in these faculties, there were younger students, younger people teaching. Some were working on advanced degrees. Obviously, with younger people and a lot of names that we don't know, much of the material is mediocre, even though it did demand a great deal of formal knowledge, actually. All of these people could get traction in arguments that would be very difficult for us to find our way within. But some of the material was very good, especially in grammar, logic, and astronomy. Now, the more advanced work in philosophy was actually done by the faculties of theology, because they were awarding, of course, the doctorate degree. And it's very interesting. Within theological work, you'll find long sections sometimes devoted to philosophy almost as an end in itself. People were very interested in some of the philosophical issues that we'll be seeing later on in these lectures. Early on, of course, as we develop, the lectio, the lecture, was very, very important. And in fact, so important that the actual books we have from the period often are merely abbreviations of the oral arguments. It was an oral culture. Information was disseminated orally. People remembered well. And books oftentimes were just ways of jogging memories of what was going on in these oral arguments. However, as time went on and we reached the 14th century, we see books becoming more important and as an end in themselves. Lectures themselves, well, ordinary lectures were delivered on, stipulated course books, repeated regularly. That's why they're called ordinary lectures, right? And you can look into the tradition and you can see all of the things that were lectured upon. But of course, certainly there were lectures on much of Aristotle's organon, right? His organon and much of his philosophical work standardly lectured upon in these MA, in these Masters of Arts curricula. There could be extraordinary lectures, however, on books that were not required in the curriculum by statute. And yes, wouldn't it be wonderful to live in a time where there were statutes that said all the lectures had to be on Aristotle, right? I mean, can you imagine what kind of ethos would develop if you could presuppose that everybody basically knew the prior analytics and the posterior analytics and the topics and on interpretation and the categories? What kind of world would it be if everybody knew these things? That would be a little bit, I suppose, like if you hang out, let's say during the Manhattan Project, when people were developing the atom bomb here in America. We had a lot of the great physicists of the day hanging out together out on the desert. And they all could presuppose certain amounts of knowledge on all kinds of things. They could talk to each other. Just imagine hundreds of people being able to talk to each other from different universities because they all read the same books and they all knew different commentaries on these books. Anyway, cursory lectures were also possible. These are short reviews, if you will, of main problems connected with the standard text. So you might have a lecture on, perhaps a cursory lecture on Aristotle's notion of the soul, right? And what kind of problems this would have with regard to perhaps Christian theology. There was a certain form of the lecture in those days, different than our lectures. One would read aloud a section of the litera, that is the actual text, and then one would divide, or one would look at the disposition of the text and give an account of the division of the text. And then one would do an exposition of each part of the text. And this exposition would include a precise interpretation of the text in the form of rules, right? So, nota, we have that Latin word, note, would be a way of directing us to these rules of interpretation for the text. Discussion happened then on important points of the text, and this came in the form of a disputation, which we'll talk about in a minute here. But there would be a part of the lecture that would raise issues about interpretation of the text. And this was the part of the dubium est, or it is doubtful, or dubitandum est. This must be doubted, or ought to be doubted. It is to be doubted that, and then we look at one side and the other side. Now, if you read these things now, of course, many people today wouldn't get any traction in the actual questions. But if you got traction in the question, you could kind of understand how these various views were out there. And one would be able to be a master who would argue a particular view, but not based upon his or her own creativity. This is interesting. I mean, there were, of course, very creative masters, masters of great virtuosity. That's what I'm trying to say. But one would almost do this in terms of the tradition. A master was one who knew the tradition well and knew the pro and con arguments and was able to make his way through these arguments. Almost maybe a little bit more like Talmud, the way that the rabbinical scholars would deal with the tradition and be able to appeal to various precedents of interpretation upon the tradition, and which itself became a tradition. Well, from about 1260 on, lectures on the dubium est developed, and these were called the quaestiones, which is just Latin for questions. And so this became some of the very interesting parts of the reading of the lecture. And if you ever read these lectures, you can still see them. I've done a little bit of this. One wants to go to the questiones generally because they're the most interesting of these. Well, in those days, people needed to dispute. One could not hide in one's office as a professor and maybe, make a contribution to some small field of research, be basically incompetent in the classroom and boring. Because everybody knew every other professor, right? Why? Because they had to dispute. Masters of theology, the professors here in these programs, had to lecture, preach, and dispute. And these disputations were frequent, even weekly. Friday afternoon lecture, disputation was a rule in many places. So you knew Friday afternoon the faculty was going to get together and dispute. It's very different now. We are so individualistic. It was a community then, an ethos. And one would imagine that through the next week, one would find various faculty members talking to each other about how the disputations went and how well a particular master was, how competent he was in answering objections and addressing issues. Ordinary disputations, those that are called ordinary disputations, were on a single topic. But the so-called special disputations, which happen maybe a couple times a year, were open to a wider public. And this is called the quolibetales questiones, which means the questions on whatever, right? The questions on whatever things that are important, or deemed to be important. Independent disputations in the arts faculty might be called, and these were called sophismata, right? Sophismata, you know, probably not the connotation of the sophists, sophismata, but you can see the Greek derivation here. The largest part of the sophismata were dedicated to the master's solution of the problem. Okay, so the master had a solution, and in the sophismata, he gives this solution, and then he would address objections to his solution. Really, when you think about the disputations, they seem a little like the dialectical procedure of Aristotle, right? We remember with Aristotle that one has an aporia, right? And there is a presenting of a problem, a puzzlement, and then one would collect conflicting opinions from the philosophical tradition. These opinions are endoxa, and then one goes in and resolves the difficulty. And of course, Aristotle does this. In the disputations, we see this kind of thing happening, but we see it happening actually before people really recovered Aristotle in the West. So you're thinking, well, when did people recover Aristotle in the West? Well, I think 12th century. And of course, they hadn't lost all of Aristotle, but they had lost much of Aristotle, right? Certainly his physics and natural sciences, his work in biology, meteorology, all of these things had been missing, if you will. And only some of his logic was known in the West. Of course, we've seen before that the categories and de interpretatione were always known in the West. Perhaps, actually, when you think about this, maybe the disputations didn't develop so much from everybody reading Aristotle, because, of course, we see that before Aristotle was very popular, this disputation form was in place. Perhaps it grew out of the lectio itself, the lectures itself, the way that one would have the dubium est and deal with those questions in controversy. Of course, as time developed, written work itself emerged from the disputation form. For instance, the Summa Theologica of Thomas Aquinas fits very well this framework. In the Summa Theologica, we have certain questions and we have articles, and we generally have the odds. Okay, some people say this, 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 and then there's a quote from an authority, oftentimes scripture, sometimes a philosophical authority. The master, now Aquinas says, I respond, and he lays it all out, and then there are the responses to the objections that began the article. And this is just standard. You go all the way through the Summa. If you read some of his other work, he doesn't have just 3 or 4 or 5 odds. 14, you'll find in some of Aquinas' other work, he might have 14 odds. That means against, right? And then he gives his position and he responds to all of those. But you can see how this could be a written form of what was happening in the disputations themselves, as we have this back and forth movement. Now, one could get into the precise form of the disputations and how the rules are, and there is work done in this area. I've read some of it, and it's very interesting work. Some of it we don't know really deeply. We're making some guesses here. Some of it is better, shall we say, better known. I won't get into all of that here in this introductory lecture, but of course one could spend quite a bit of time just talking about the form of the disputations and the way that that changed or seemed to change over time, because by the time we get to the 14th and 15th century, the way the disputation is conducted is quite different than in the 12th. As time went on, disputations gradually became a little bit more like a vehicle for the virtuoso performance by the master. And this was not true in the early days of the disputations, where it's more like these are rules, you got a master here, but we're all part of this community, and it's learning is a kind of a divine thing, and so we're all part of almost a community gathered around learning, almost as if one would gather around the cross, if you see, if you can make sense of that. The original justification for the disputation seemed to be that people thought one could not really know the truth if he could not defend it. Why? Because to know the truth well means to know everything that is ramified by that truth, everything that is entailed by the position that you claim to be true. And oftentimes you don't know those things until other people mount an argument saying to you, well, you say this, but do you know if you say this, that means you're committed to this? Do you really want to be committed to that? And then as the master, you could say, well, no, I don't think we're really committed to that. Or, well, yes, we might be committed to that, but I still really want to be committed to this. So you can see how this works. They often say that you really don't know the subject matter until you teach it. And of course, teaching subject matter does mean that you're placing yourself in a position where a question comes from your class and they ask you something, and you can always tell a good teacher or one that's maybe not as deep by how they respond to that question. I think we've all had experiences of teachers who will respond to the question by reading their notes again or something like that. And of course, that's not the way it should be. If one knows what one is talking about, one had better be able to apply that in all kinds of contexts and to be able to answer all kinds of questions. In the medieval tradition, we had another kind of form of literature called the commentary. Now, these are very important. Commentaries are on the text, the litera, and they are reasoned unpackings of the text, right? And so they do not always reflect the views of the author. Why? Because one is unpacking the text. One can't just spin it in any direction whatsoever. These guys were not postmodern. The text was not fodder for creative spins. The text was something that one had to have a certain amount of deference for and reverence for. And even if ultimately what the text said was perhaps not true theologically, one still had to have a reverence for the text and a humility in the face of the text, because of course it was from a very smart guy. I'm thinking here of Aristotle. Okay. The question commentaries developed in the last half of the 13th century. And these commentaries did not remain as close to the original form of the disputation as did this Sophismata, questiones disputate and the questiones quad libertales. Sorry, I'm not flowing here with my Latin. But anyway, we also find in this time of commentaries, and of course there were commentaries on Bible, but there were commentaries on Aristotle, right? If you think about that, who writes commentaries today? I mean, we still have Bible commentaries, but we don't really have commentaries on a philosopher. Well, maybe you see something like this. Thinking of a commentary, a couple of ones that I read on Wittgenstein back a number of years ago. But still, it's not a major form of literature as it was at the time. The Summa, which is a collection of knowledge, and the Tractatus, developed as well. The Summa, a collection of knowledge, a summary of this knowledge, and the Tractatus, a treatise on a particular thing. These became new literary genres of this time. I think this lecture is probably long enough at this point, and so I'm going to take a brief pause and come back with a shorter lecture on Aristotle and his use in the 13th century. So we'll be right back. Thank you.